Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Can you hear me okay? We are really excited about this last panel. It's going to be exciting, nuts and bolts discussion of psychedelic law reform. And to moderate this and to kind of carry this space, we have Ariel Clark, who is a founding partner of Clark Howell, a woman-owned and run law firm focused on the cannabis and hemp industries. The firm represents established and emerging cannabis businesses across the supply chain, and she has served in leadership positions in the Los Angeles Cannabis Task Force, the Cannabis Business Council of Santa Barbara County, California Native American Cannabis Association, California Growers Association, and California NORML. Ariel is also very honored to be a member of Chacruna's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants. And so thank you, Ariel, for joining us. While we're getting you started, I also just wanted to thank Bia for all the work you've done on organizing this. This has been an amazing day. It's been an amazing amount of information. And also to thank Aaron, who's our tech support and who's been there with us every moment since this started. And Josh Meadow, who many of you have received emails from, and also Horacio that provides a lot of support here at Chacruna. So we are really excited for this final panel of the day and for taking things on tomorrow, but I will pass it over to Ariel, who's going to be moderating this space. So thank you so much. And thanks, Ariel.
Thank you so much, Zara. And thanks everyone, Bia, Andrew, Aaron, everyone here. It's been an absolutely amazing day. I know everyone agrees with that. There's been so much wonderful content, so many thoughtful discussions, and I just want to say that I'm deeply honored and humbled to be here tonight. As Zara mentioned, I am a lawyer, and I've been involved in drug policy reform and activism for the last 15 years. And actually, I echo what Sandor said this morning when he said that in terms of how did he come to policy, that he was born into it. And that same goes for me. So I'm very honored to be with you all tonight. We are going to have a discussion about the nuts and bolts of psychedelic law reform. And, you know, the purpose of this discussion tonight is really to get deep into specific mechanisms that can be used in psychedelic law reform, how they can be used, what are the mechanisms that we can use to undo prohibition, to create safe access and safe supply. We need to understand that, and we need to have this conversation and so many others over the next quite a while. And we're having this conversation tonight because these legal models are already in play, right? We've got states with ballot initiatives, and we'll get specific on some of those tonight. We have a number of local jurisdictions, or a handful, a little less than a handful so far, that have decriminalized certain types of psychedelics or fungi, and many other local jurisdictions that are coming down the pike. There are also countries outside of the United States that have taken different approaches to policy reform, to legalization, to regulation, to decriminalization. And I guess I'll just take a quick pause to let folks know who are maybe not so familiar with those ideas what some of those concepts means very quickly. Decriminalization means no criminal penalties. Regulation generally means that government is involved in some form or fashion, promulgating rules and regulations, issuing businesses, business licenses or permits, and they have some say over how supply happens and how consumption happens. And legalization generally means regulation, but sometimes it's a combination of regulation and decriminalization. So I will say that a couple more things. One, that this is a very timely discussion, and we will talk about decriminalization, we will talk about regulation as others have done today. It's interesting, Oakland is one of those cities that passed a local initiative for decriminalization of fungi or of psychedelics and fungi, and is already talking about regulation and in particular distribution and sales. So Our discussion tonight, talking about these different levers, as another gentleman earlier today talked about 120 different levers one can use in these different mechanisms for law reform. We will get specific on that stuff tonight. So as an entry point for this discussion, I've asked my co-panelists to speak about certain initiatives. So as was mentioned, we have Kevin Matthews, David Bronner, and Ryan Munevar. Ryan will speak about California, David will speak about the Oregon initiatives, and Kevin will speak about Denver. I've asked the panelists who are coming up to speak with us tonight to talk about a specific set of questions, but really from, and about the legal mechanisms, but really also from the vantage point of what will society look like post-implementation. As we look at law reform worldwide, I think it's very helpful to think about kind of in practice how our societies will change, how will I have access to these substances, other folks. So that's why this first set of questions is really about consumption, supply, distribution, and what social good is being created by implementing this law reform. So first up, we have Kevin Matthews. Kevin was with Decriminalized Denver and is co-founder of SPORE, the Society for Psychedelic Outreach, Reform, and Education. Kevin also produced the Sacred Solidarity Festival this last weekend, which was incredibly special. So hopefully he will be coming up here soon and we will hear from him, because I am excited to hear about Denver and what's happening on the ground there. We could also jump to some of the other folks who are on the panel tonight. Oh, great. My friend, here you are.
Hi, Ariel.
Hello, sir. How are you? So thank you so much for joining us tonight. So I was just framing the discussion. So we'd love to hear what's happening in Denver and kind of also about the initiative itself. What type of psychedelic model passed there? What are you all talking about? And what kind of social good are you all trying to accomplish?
Amazing. And thank you. And just to do a quick mic check, can everyone who's watching hear me okay? Looks like it. Okay, perfect. Well, I'm very, very grateful to be here today and really excited. As Ariel mentioned, this is a very timely conversation. After our success in Denver, there's tremendous momentum in other states and other cities across the country to start considering decriminalizing, of course, not just psilocybin, but also entheogens, also other entheogens like Oakland and Santa Cruz. And so, I want to say thank you all for being here and watching today. And our organization, SPORE, the Society for Psychedelic Outreach, Reform, and Education, is proud to be a silver sponsor of the Psychedelic Liberties Summit. And I really want to give a huge shout out to Bia and the entire team for organizing this incredible online festival summit today. It's pretty amazing. So nuts and bolts in Denver. So May 2019 in Denver, we effectively decriminalized the personal possession, personal use, and personal cultivation of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. And so what does decriminalization mean, especially when you're considering that at the state and federal level, psilocybin is still a Schedule I substance? I think that we got as close as we could to a true decriminalization here in Denver is because we not only, made the possession, use, and cultivation of mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority in the city, but we've also prevented the city from spending any public funds on actually prosecuting individuals here in Denver. So what does that mean? It means that individuals in the city and county of Denver are able to grow, use, and possess mushrooms. And this is for personal use. And individuals also specifically cannot distribute or sell mushrooms. The legal term there is distribution for remuneration, and remuneration means that you make a profit off of the sale. So individuals can't do that, but they can grow and cultivate at home. And the mechanism by which we accomplished this, which was different than what happened in Oakland, is that we had a public ballot initiative. And so we had to go through the process with our city and county here to, draft a language and have that language approved. And then from there, start collecting signatures and get approved to start collecting signatures. And thankfully in Denver, with our population in the city and county of Denver is relatively small compared to the rest of the metropolitan area. And so we had to collect roughly 10,000 signatures in order to qualify for the ballot. We only needed about 5,000 signatures, but when you're running a political campaign, for any of you who are familiar with this work, you usually want to essentially double the amount of signatures that are required so that you can account for folks who are very excited to say yes and sign a ballot initiative to vote for decriminalizing mushrooms, but they don't actually live in the Denver metro or in the city and county of Denver. So after we gathered our signatures and qualified for the ballot, and then we went on to the Get Out the Vote campaign. And so really from last year, 2019, from just about the first week of February through May 7th, we were campaigning. We were knocking on doors. We were, creating events for folks to get involved and learn more about the campaign and learn more about psilocybin and its potential health benefits. And we were successful. I'm not sure. Even just thinking about it, I kind of skyrocket back to cloud 9 that day, because we had a come from behind victory, which was I think a tremendous shock, not only to myself and our entire team, but to the world as well, where we overcame about a 7,000 vote margin in the course of about 16 hours and just inched right ahead. We succeeded in Denver with a 50.65% who voted yes on the initiative. And so that was really just a tremendous example of how, there's that saying where, you just bring an incredible number of folks together who are all very passionate and committed to a single idea. And then, the intention is there just to get this thing across the finish line. And so it was a tremendous pleasure and really a huge learning opportunity and learning curve to work on this political campaign, because I was a first-time campaign director, really a first-time activist for this work. And the most important and exciting part of the work that I can see so far, having continued engaging in this field, really is, what is this community that exists? And from what I can see in the chat box over here, there is an incredible community of folks worldwide who support, some kind of psychedelic legislative reform. And so, and Ariel, please, if you find me blabbing, feel free to cut in. So right now in Denver, the main concern with the city is that we didn't have a limit on the amount of psilocybin that a person can possess or even cultivate. And that was really the first hurdle with our campaign. Once we were successful, was convincing the city, hey, it's at the time I was working with a wonderful woman named Cindy Sovine, and she helped kind of lead the way in the conversations with the city at that time. And she told the city, she was like, look, guys, we don't have the right, nor does the city have the right. And of course, we're talking to the DA, the city attorney's office, members of the police department, and the Department of Safety, and the Department of Health. We don't have a right, and the city also does not have a right to determine what an acceptable amount for personal use is. And then especially when you consider folks who are growing at home, right? What does that look like? And so essentially the city, after negotiating this for a few months, decided to essentially hold off. And right now we're simply just collecting data. And what I was told by the then director of the Department of Safety here in Denver, he said, Kevin, I'm not concerned about mushrooms unless the data starts to change, meaning that we start seeing more arrests or more sales or more crime related to psilocybin. And, in the year since the initiative has passed, almost a year now, we're about a month away, there have been very few arrests. I think the last number I heard was 4 arrests in the city and county of Denver. And they were essentially, 2 of those arrests were people who were underage. And then other arrests were related to distribution. And so as far as it stands right now, the city and county of Denver has been really tremendously open-minded and really allowing and encouraging kind of our group to take the lead here and guide the conversation in terms of what's possible down the road. And so one other thing that our initiative created was a first of its kind municipal body. It's called the Denver Psilocybin Mushroom Policy Review Panel. And the purpose of that panel is to collect data and report on the effects of psilocybin decriminalization in the city and county of Denver. I work on that panel along with other members of other folks who worked on the campaign, and also with folks at the city level in Denver, the DA, representatives from the city attorney and the sheriff's office and the police department. And right now that panel did make the final decision not to enforce any specific limit on possession. And then we also, our first order of business in that panel was to essentially determine the specific reporting criteria that law enforcement must use if they end up having any kind of law enforcement contact related to psilocybin. And so whether or not an arrest is made, both the Denver Police Department and the Sheriff's Office are going to be collecting very specific data, including things, like, age, race, gender, the substances that are involved in, if there's an arrest, but also things like the person's mindset, their mental state, or the environment that they were in, because those are some of the data points that we'd like to collect in terms of discovering how folks in Denver are utilizing mushrooms. And the scope of that panel, we can really, I think, go kind of as broad as we want. And so over the course of the next 9 months or so, we'll be looking at potential research options here in Denver, and then also other means to collect data and really, try and find out what does use look like in the city. And then potentially from there start to discover, what does this look like in terms of, if there is a future statewide model that introduces, for example, a regulated medical model, what does that look like? What are the kinds of, what does licensing look like? What do qualifications look like for people who may be a sitter or a guide or facilitate a session for somebody who's under the influence of psilocybin? So there's a lot of possibility. It's still very new in the city right now, but so far it's been tremendously successful. And I think overall that people are really just very curious. Although we had, it was about 97,000 people vote yes on this in Denver, we know that there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of folks in the state of Colorado who are very interested in psilocybin mushrooms, or they can't pronounce the word, right? And so what are psilocybin mushrooms? Well, magic mushrooms, and we're realizing that we really have a duty and a responsibility to make sure that we're, conducting outreach now and really focusing on education and providing a platform for folks to get involved in this community that's growing, and also especially to share their voice and even more so step up as leaders and help work on future campaigns, either statewide or in other municipalities in Denver. And I think to kind of round it out, Ariel, I think the most promising thing, and this was really surprising to me, I was not expecting this, but the most promising thing that's come out of this so far is that, as I mentioned earlier, I had been, speaking with members of our Department of Safety and the DA's office and the police. And, another thing that was mentioned is that our law enforcement officials right now are so much more concerned about getting treatment for drug offenders. The former Department of Safety director out here, he was like, 50% of our inmates in Denver, they have mental and behavioral health issues. They're not getting the treatment they need behind bars. And so it seems like decriminalizing psilocybin here in some ways was kind of a Trojan horse to be able to have a conversation, a really direct conversation with city officials here about the city's drug enforcement policies. And, thankfully, psilocybin has a lot of potential, right, to treat things like depression, anxiety, potentially addiction to things like opioids. And so I think that as we move forward, we are definitely going to see a larger effort in part of our city here in terms of shifting away from criminalization to a more compassionate treatment model for folks who for drug offenders. So instead of throwing folks in jail, they want to start providing treatment options. And Denver is no exception. It's a microcosm of the rest of the country. We have this global mental health and addiction crisis that's going on right now. And, both with, skyrocketing rates of depression and anxiety. And then also, of course, we have this global opioid, epidemic that's occurring where folks are suffering needlessly and dying. And, psychedelics can potentially help solve some of these issues that we're facing, not only as a society, but globally. And Denver has the same issues. So, it's still early. It's very exciting right now to be a part of this movement. And yeah, it's just tremendous to share this information, because I think folks need to learn this information. There's so many ways that anyone can either start a ballot initiative or like they did in Oakland, lobby the city council and push a resolution, or go to your state legislature. So what's most important here, though, is this community. This community, is a constituency as well, and it's also an electorate. And if we're all in good communication and sharing best practices with each other, then I think that we have a real opportunity here to create some tremendous legislative change in terms of psychedelics in the very near future. We're watching it unfold before our eyes right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That's just, it's really amazing. It's incredible, the coalitions that are being built, all of the education, that it's so data-driven, that we're hearing that law enforcement is coming from a place of compassion around issues that, as you say, are happening worldwide. So I just thank you for all of the work that you're doing, and thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
All right, so next up, we're going to have Ryan Munevar come up to the stage. Ryan is the campaign director for Decriminalized California. Ryan actually previously has been involved in various local and state cannabis reform initiatives, and as well, I guess, was part owner in a cannabis company that was sold to MedMen, which we probably all know about as a big cannabis behemoth company. So love to have Ryan come up on the stage and chat with us. I'll just say that it was definitely a disappointment that the California initiative didn't gain enough signatures, likely because of COVID-19 and the fact that we cannot collect electronic signatures in California. But it will be interesting to hear about the specifics of the initiative, as well as if there's going to be a next time. I read in the news, Ryan, that there will be a next time. So hopefully you can come and tell us about it. Or Kevin, you and I can just continue. I mean, I will say this, while we're waiting for Ryan, one thing that I thought was really kind of interesting, or would be a kind of interesting discussion point with you is, Denver and Colorado has been so on the forefront of back with cannabis reform, and now we have other approach to psilocybin. And I was sort of curious, maybe that create sort of fertile ground to have this coalition building that you're seeing right now, that you're very closely involved with. And I was kind of curious if there were things that you would say, here are things that I'd leave behind and that kind of the community is saying, from cannabis legalization, regulation, but here are some of the things that we like that worked, just because we're going to be piggybacking on some of these rules and regulations and initiative and what has been as we move forward, both how not to be and how we want to be?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've given a lot of consideration to what what are the lessons that we can learn from the cannabis industry. I mean, we decriminalized psilocybin, and specifically decriminalized it because to us it's an equity issue. Right now, because we couldn't really install any kind of a regulated model in Denver, the only step to take was to decriminalize there. And if we're considering broader initiatives, we're going statewide. And I think there's two issues. One, really monitoring law enforcement, monitoring arrests. Although Denver, the state of Colorado, made recreational marijuana legal, unfortunately, arrests for minors skyrocketed in the years after that, which doesn't make any sense at all. Where police are targeting people of color and marginalized communities for a legal, plant substance, right? And so that's one reason why this panel is so important, because it enables us who are working on the panel to just kind of monitor how law enforcement is if they are, and they really shouldn't be enforcing psilocybin in the city, right? And then specifically, who are they arresting? Is there a trend there with that? So that's the one thing that we really have to take care of. I think the other part, when we're considering access, right? Like, we want to make it as accessible as possible for folks if there is an eventual, let's just say, a regulated medical framework that's going to require licensing and things like that. So how are we reducing costs on the user's end? And also, how are we, having a kind of making sure that barrier to entry in the field is small for folks who want to either provide treatment services or cultivate. So, but we got Ryan here, so good to see you, man.
How's it going, man? How you doing, Ariel?
I'm great. Really, really nice to see you. So glad you were able to make it up on the stage. So Ryan, as you know, we've asked that everyone sort of address the same set of questions as relates to these different legal models. And so I'd love for you to start us out with the California model in terms of what did or does the initiative cover, what type of legal reform model, who would have access under that model, who would supply, who would produce, even what type of business entities would be available to apply for that, what type of licenses, all of that. And I'd also like you to round out in the end with what sort of social good would your initiative accomplish?
Sure. So basically, the California initiative is an open source initiative. We started it back in December of 2018. And the way it was structured was simply on a Google Drive document where it allowed a bunch of people to come in and make suggestions about what they wanted to see in this. And at the top of the list is basically cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, consumption, transport, possession. All of these things are totally as close to legal as you're honestly going to get at a statewide initiative level. So one of the biggest things that happens was we actually started out with two different versions. One of them specifically, what is that?
It's the fun of being a virtual conference, all the beautiful surprises. Just
no doubt. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Can you see me at all though?
No, but your face is in our mind's eye.
Okay, give me 1 second. Let me try something.
Okay. All right. I have to say, I'm
Hold on.
Okay, turn it off, man. The video showed up with your face in it.
Oh, what? Okay.
seems that that's someone you know.
We're back. All right. Can you reset or send me the thing again? Ariel, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Can you see me at all on video?
Nope, but we can hear you clearly.
Okay. So basically what ended up happening was we started out with an original draft that what ended up happening was we wanted to have amnesty and expungement. That's actually the end of the social component that's required for this, an actual social equity, in the form of amnesty, expungement for anybody who was actually prosecuted for possession of psychedelic mushrooms. So what ended up happening is we got stuck on this definition of distribution because all these people basically wanted to sell this as a product to some degree. And then we started going down the path of trying to figure out what regulation would look like. And what ended up happening was it became the, in essence, antithesis to what went wrong with cannabis inside of California. So, okay, we're back up on monitor. All right, so what ended up happening from there, the conversation then went next to taxation. And well, taxation was horrible in cannabis in California because they started the taxation rate at the beginning of cultivation, then they went to manufacturing, then they went to wholesale distribution, had no write-offs, and then you had an extra tax that was, in essence, an excise tax, which is also a sin tax, on top of the regular sales tax that existed for cannabis. So that's why in California, an eighth costs $60 when it should be more like $20 from a gray market dispensary. And we use the term gray market because it's not technically white market, because at the federal level, even cannabis is still illegal. So after we figured out those two components, what ended up taking up the majority of the time in the drafting of the language, at least a third of the actual language itself, was the amnesty and expungement component. And that was the only section we actually took from the California Initiative Prop 64 that actually went through previously, based off of some of the regulational cleanup bills that went through afterwards as well, so that if you've been convicted, we could get this off of your record, at least at the state level. So there are three major pillars to any proper decriminalization / legalization effort for any substance out there. The first one is the access. Does everybody in the society have access to it? In some cases, in the case of California dispensaries, it's bottlenecked. Either you have to go to the shop or you get a mobile delivery service. But unfortunately, if you live in an area where they still have a moratorium or in essence a ban on cannabis, you can't get access to it. So we didn't want to see that model replicated out. And then when it came to the quality of the substance, this is a big issue. People are going to want to see some form of testing and some sort of regulational oversight to make sure that this product that actually has a label on it that says this is psilocybin / psilocin containing mushrooms of X percentage in weight, that's actually valid. And the organization that would basically control that at the government level is actually the California Department of Food and Agriculture. They can already do that in the form of basically standard operating procedures for standard edible mushrooms that are out there. Most of the time, that's actually taken into account to make sure there aren't any additives in there that are toxic to human beings, or that, for example, there isn't an outbreak of E. coli that was actually added by human beings for not properly washing their hands. And then the third part of it, of course, is the price, which is the thing I talked about earlier with the taxation component. So when you look at it, it's basically access, it's quality of the substance, and then it's the price of the substance. And the reason why I use the word substance as opposed to necessarily a medicine or a sacrament or a drug is because it's kind of more encompassing depending on how you want to use it. So for example, if a person has a medical condition that they feel psilocybin / psilocin is going to help them, perhaps some form of neurogenesis or damage to the brain, in that case, it's a medicine. In the case of, let's say they incorporated this as part of their spiritual practice, or it's been part of their people's indigenous culture since the beginning of their people, in essence, then technically that borders more on the spiritual sacramental form. Then when it comes to, in essence, a drug, as a lot of people like to refer to drugs as something that's recreational. My version of a drug is, I do have a gradation. There's good drugs and there's bad drugs. It's basically how it makes me feel when I'm taking it and then how I feel the day after. And for psilocybin, magic mushrooms, it's just, it's a grand slam for me. I just absolutely love it. It feels amazing when you're taking it. And at least for me, the day after, I don't feel bad. In fact, I generally feel better and more introspective about what's going on. So what ended up happening is COVID-19 plague. We've all been there. That's why we're here right now. That's the reason why basically 6 weeks ago, we had to pull the plug on our campaign for actually going out there to collect signatures. And that's why we're going to have to redo this going forward for the 2022 election.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I just have a couple follow-up questions. I'm quite curious to hear a little bit more about what resonated with voters and sort of what did they find most uncomfortable. So far as I understand, it was a more of a sort of almost like an agricultural type initiative where CDFA, California Department of Food and Ag, would oversee licensing of various sorts. It seems somewhat analogous to a cannabis type initiative as well, but a little bit different or quite different. So I kind of curious to learn more what your feedback was within the voting community, within the elected officials, and so we can learn from your experience.
Well, we actually did a poll with David Bronner's help. The poll was $40,000, 500, and it was a 17-minute worth questionnaire, sampled 600 people across California by the proper demographics for Democrats, percent-wise reference to Republicans, and then no party preference. And some of the things we found, for example, by the poll, it probably wants to be an older age group of people that have access to this. So originally we listed 18 as the definition of an adult. But the problem is a person can still be in high school when they're 18. So when we have to go back into 2022, considering we're going into a more conservative year because it's not a presidential election, it's a governor's race in essence, and only homeowners and people that bitch about paying taxes actually show up to vote for that one as it is. So we're probably going to have to amend our version of the language, which is technically version 4.4 to version 4.5 and eventually 4.6 when we actually refile with the state. We'll probably bump that age group up from 18 to 21. And then as far as the education that we actually did to get out to people, I've taught a lot of different classes for a lot of different things in my life, from my creative writing and filmmaking. And the thing that I found absolutely amazing was the turnout for the magic mushroom classes. We would have people on a sliding scale where basically, if you could take the class, you got there 2 weeks early, it was $100. If you were the last 3 days before the last day, it was $125, and then the day of, it's $150 cash at the door. But we always had a slot or two available for somebody if they didn't have the means or they were just cheap. They could take the class for free as long as they volunteered for the campaign. And so I thought, that's a clever idea. We're going to sort this out. And then we started having classes where there's like 40 and 50 people showing up. And they're walking in and out with these tubs, and we're showing them everything how to do it. We take them through the entire process of sterilization, to inoculation, setting up your chambers, all the stuff that you need to do. And the craziest thing is, when people found out for the cost of about $125 just to get the basic stuff that you need, like a pressure cooker and whatnot, after that, to produce a pound, of dried psilocybin mushrooms, that's 454 grams, it costs between $7 and $11, all right? And then when you take it, for example, dosage, 100 milligram to 250 milligrams is generally the spectrum that people would equate to a microdose. Proper dose is 3.5 grams. Heroic dose is 5 grams. On top of that, you take 454, divide by 5, all right? You basically get 90 doses out of something that costs you between $7 to $11. So the average price of a heroic dose, that's 5 grams, right? That's a good start to a weekend, is between 11 to 12 cents. So when you teach people how to do that at that rate, they become very fond of you very quickly. And the problem was, a lot of my students kept showing up with these pounds of dried mushrooms at every one of our weekly meetings. I'm like, oh my God, you can't do this. But, thank you for the continued gestures of support. And then what happened after that? Oh my God, we taught, I don't know, maybe 600-700 people between myself and the mycology director, who actually is like a biologist in the north. He held down the classes in the north. I did the ones in the south between LA, Orange County, San Diego. It's been wild. So people, they actually do want access to this, but they want access to this to the point where they could grow it as cheaply as tomatoes in their backyard. And they would also like the option of substances that come online later down the line. So things like not just growing out of the ground, but some people would like the analog version of this, simply because if you have a single molecule that you're basically testing against other subjects, it's very easy to do that. Mushroom in itself, there's something that's kind of like the entourage effect, similar to cannabis. So there's a lot of different chemicals interacting in a lot of different ways. But if you want to do proper solid science for a start, you start with analogs. And then after that, if a person has the ability to cultivate their own, or basically go to a grocery store just like it was for tomatoes and pick up their own, that seems pretty good to me as far as access. So yeah, more questions.
Okay, great. Well, that's great for right now. We're going to invite David Bronner up to the stage. David is CEO of Dr. Bronner Soaps. He's a board member of MAPS. He's been a longtime activist and financial supporter of psychedelic reform and other social good movements. He is going to talk to us tonight about the 2 initiatives in Oregon. So David, welcome to the stage. I'll say, as he is becoming introduced up to our discussion tonight, that it's interesting that in Oregon there are 2 separate initiatives, one that handles more decriminalization and one that deals more with regulation. So hopefully we will get deep into that. I think there's been a lot of interest in the Oregon initiatives. And right now, Oregon is the one statewide initiative that we hope will gather, or those two will gather enough signatures to get on the ballot. I think they have until July 2nd, if I'm not mistaken. And we can also chat a little bit more between you and I, Ryan. I'll ask you a question. I was curious about this. You know, I've done a good amount of political work in my career and in my life. And sometimes when you're putting together an initiative or trying to make some sort of change, alliances and concessions need to be made in certain regards. And I was curious, what would you say were kind of the most challenging compromises or concessions that you had to make in the course of putting together your initiative?
You know, that's actually a great question. A lot of it was the restriction on the size of the initiative. Hold on, let me show you. So the idea was basically to be able to have an initiative that could be printed on an 11 by 17 sheet that would allow for both sides of it to actually come up. So there was a restriction on the amount of length that we can do, because if we had to go to anything longer than that, we'd have to use a binding company. So a lot of people would have these ideas that they wanted to see put in there, but they just weren't feasible. But then other than that, David just signed on. So you want to take a hop on that?
Hello, David. So great to meet you. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here tonight. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So as we discussed, just to sort of have a compare and contrast and get specific on these different reform initiatives, we'd love it if you can speak to Oregon's two initiatives from the perspective of what type of psychedelic law reform initiatives are they? Who is able to access what substances or medicines? How do they access it? Does anyone administer it? And all of that. And then, of course, to end with what social good are Oregon's initiatives seeking to achieve.
Right on. Yeah, happy to do so. And originally Sheree Eckert, one of the chief petitioners, along with her husband, Tom, was going to be on this panel, but asked me to swap in, was facing some challenges. But is very much the heart and soul of the campaign, or both the Eckerts are. They're therapists. They deal a lot with, especially domestic abuse, both perpetrators and survivors. Are very deeply familiar with cycles of trauma and interruption, and how we can interrupt that and heal that with psilocybin assisted therapy. And they had the vision that, how do we replicate the rigor of the FDA clinical trials? Like, all of our campaigns obviously reference the amazing outcomes being produced in the, major depressive disorder trials out of Johns Hopkins and NYU and UCLA. Also the addiction studies, the end-of-life anxiety studies. So, how do we, replicate that? And make this kind of well-structured access for everybody, where, but not limited to a qualifying diagnosis. So you don't have to have a, diagnosis of major depressive disorder, or be about to die, or, be in the throes of severe addiction. Like, all of us obviously can benefit hugely from these medicines. We're all struggling and can really be helped to find our higher, better selves and be awesome and connect to nature and just generally be our awesomest. And but the decriminalization is awesome. We were major contributors to the Denver campaign. It was one of pretty much my best birthday present ever on May 7th when Denver won. And we very much believe in decriminalizing all of our medicines and access, and the free access, or for everybody, including especially people who can't afford therapy. But having kind of a well-structured therapeutic model makes that accessible to your average person who's psychedelically naive and not necessarily comfortable accessing medicine in a decriminalized environment. although we very much support SPORE and the post-implementation in Denver, and are seeing Denver being an example, along with Oakland, of responsible integration of medicine, and then building out from there the kind of education around proper preparation, set and setting, proper facilitation, proper integration. But out of the gate, that's what the Oregon model is. It's just very much about accessing therapy in this kind of really optimized context. And I think, thinking about my mom and most people's moms, this is the kind of model that is going to be most comfortable to access. Ryan made a lot of good points about how cannabis is overtaxed and overregulated. And what we're doing in Oregon is we're likewise making sure there's only minimal tax, only enough to cover the cost of the program. There's no sin tax, no nothing, to keep the whole kind of big cannabis branding and corporate takeover. Licenses are limited. The grow light, there's no limit in number, but each grow operation is limited in size and scope. So you can make a good livelihood, but you're not going to be able to make $1 billion enterprise in Oregon about it. On the service center side, you can have up to 5 clinics, but you won't have like 100 chain clinics. So it's really trying to optimize the quality and build into the structure, preventative measures, so we don't see what happened with cannabis. It is so Ryan referenced some of the things the poll told us in California, and definitely, their voters do have concerns around there being some kind of controls and age limit, 18 versus 21. And that's something we've really seen in our polling in Oregon as well. It's definitely people are, they're not familiar with mushrooms. They don't really know a lot about it. They're just wanting to make sure that it is delivered in a way that is, reasonably safe. Now, Oregon, it really errs on the side of a very tightly circumscribed program. So it's you cannot access the medicine outside of a therapeutic licensed facility. So you can only take the medicine in the context of a supervised session. So it's really, really optimizing that therapeutic container, which in many ways is kind of the Western analog to the ceremonial indigenous container. So we're really optimizing all the set and setting and proper preparation and all the emphasis. Basically replicating what's coming out of the amazing trials out of Hopkins and NYU. And then alongside that, we have a broad-based decriminalization measure. So this is a Portugal-style decriminalization. The focus is not on plant medicines or psychedelics in general, although those will all be decriminalized, but is more focused on ending the systemic racism of mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow in our society that mass incarceration represents. America is about 4% of the world's population and has 22% of the prisoner population of the world. It's the number one in that regard. So this measure is very much about ending mass incarceration of people of color. It does have the side effect of decriminalizing all of our favorite allies, but not in the quantities that decriminalized Denver or the decriminalized nature would like to see. So also in Oregon, you have the decriminalized nature movements in various cities, in particular in Portland. And we're helping, it's a good team, and they're making progress with the city council. They're not going to be able to qualify for the ballot, but we're hoping to get a day of testimony in front of the city council and be able to move a decriminalized nature style legislation through the city of Portland prior to the November statewide vote, because we feel like that will really set up both measures nicely, and that will be ideal. Of course, with COVID, everything is difficult. But in our signature drive, likewise, we fortunately we're 90% of the way there. So now we're shifting to this aggressive online digital mail campaign, and it's a pain in the butt. But we're confident we're going to get it done by the July 3rd turn-in date. But we recommend everybody who has friends in Oregon help pump them up on IP 34 and on IP 44. That's respectively the psilocybin therapy and the broad-based decriminalization campaigns. And we feel like busting through in Oregon will really be the game changer. Will really open the floodgates. Just as Denver and Oakland, really set things up. Now this is going to be, I think, the game changing campaign, and then enabling Colorado, California, Washington to go as well. We're also involved in DC. We're helping a Decriminalized Nature campaign in DC. We have a very strong team in DC. So we're optimistic that we'll be able to go to the ballot, but unfortunately it's difficult because we've got a difficult board of election scenario. We've got the COVID situation. So that's much more unlikely, but we're still hopeful. So yeah, I just want, Michael Pollan is just tweeted support for the psilocybin therapy campaign. Tim Ferriss just hit his list. So we're really starting to make progress. So far, we've been pretty much the only funder, but we're hoping to unlock real funding. Although, of course, now with COVID, I guess, tanking everybody's stock portfolios, we'll see. But it is a good time to be in the soap business. So we'll, I guess, have to fill in as we have to. Yeah, and I guess I just shout out to Bia and Sandor and all the indigenous speakers, and just that's definitely, I want to just quickly touch on. Obviously, by 2024 we should be through the psychedelic renaissance. We'll have massive victories in Oregon, California, Colorado, Washington State, DC. Decriminalized Nature hopefully will run the tables in major cities. FDA approval of MDMA for treatment-resistant PTSD, FDA approval for psilocybin. So, in that kind of world, obviously the demand is going to skyrocket. It's already skyrocketing. So as we heard, the plant medicines, cannot be wild, the demand pressure on these wild gardens and of peyote in particular, but also iboga, ayahuasca to an extent. We just really need to figure that out and figure out alternative, sources. So, San Pedro or synthetic mescaline for toad, obviously synthetic 5-MeO DMT. Psilocybin mushrooms you can go big. San Pedro, you can go big. Iboga is a similar thing. You can't. It's just going to wipe out the wild iboga. We got to basically teach people about ibogaine and just really leave the iboga alone. And that's a 10-year. The iboga, obviously cultivation is the answer. And was really psyched to see Troy Sia, who'll be kicking things off tomorrow, and hear about this effort, the Cactus Conservation Institute in the Comanche Nation, and wanting to cultivate peyote, and seeing maybe in 2022 in Colorado, working closely with the Native American Church and indigenous leadership, maybe to bring in a peyote component, really very tightly, crafted according to the indigenous desires, really making sure it's not a free for all, and make sure peyote gets handled in a way that's, very respectful and accords with the indigenous wishes. But I think there's a real opportunity in Colorado potentially to really address that issue, as well as psilocybin mushrooms and our other allies. Now, I would say, I guess I did just write an article for the MAPS Bulletin. It's called The Unified Field Theory of Psychedelic Integration and Portugal-Style Decriminalization. And my dream would be that we could figure out how to combine all of the policy, each effort is accomplishing a really good policy goal. So how do we combine a broad-based decriminalization measure with higher cutoffs for our plant medicine allies that has a therapist training component? That's and legalize the sale of mushrooms in some way that is feasible politically, but with at least burdensome regulations and getting that balance. But having a grand combined measure would be the dream in 22 and 24. So yeah, I guess that's where things are at.
David, thank you so much for bringing up the indigenous perspective. We had many people who are participating in this conversation who were asking the question specifically of, and if anyone would like to jump in on this, how could legalization or decriminalization of medicines that have extensive indigenous management give back to those nations whose cultural heritage has been part of natural healing? So can we think of something that we can speak to that? How is reciprocity taken in account with thinking about involving local aspects into medicines that are taken from indigenous ways of healing?
Yeah, that's really great question. And well, first I want to mention that we have a committee building out what does this therapist training program look like, and that the state will not license therapists directly, but therapist training programs, and we're building out those criteria, and we'll have those posted up on our website pretty soon, or at least an outline form, and people can see it as it develops. And the committee is co-chaired by Tom Eckert and Françoise Brizat. Françoise Brizat was trained in the Mazatec tradition, is for 30 years. So really combines both the Mazatec shamanic approach with a modern kind of Western therapeutic approach. So we really want to combine that indigenous perspective and make sure that the program, is not like super limiting to only the Western clinical approach, although it will be very informed by that. But allow for also the indigenous Mazatec in particular approaches to really inform the criteria. Paul Stamets and Mark Hayden, Robin Carr Harris are also on that committee, so that's super exciting. And I was helping Kevin produce Sacred Solidarity, and our point really was to bring kind of like together to unify the indigenous voices and plant medicine traditions with the kind of traditional Western synthetic, LSD, MDMA approaches. We're all one. It's all about reverence and respect and preparation and integration. We raised, I guess, close to 40 grand for COVID relief between the day program, Sacred Solidarity, and MAPS After Party. And then Bronner's is matching that to the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, half to there and half to other orgs, but making that very explicit that to bring to that event, Bicycle Day, where we celebrate LSD and everything awesome about LSD and liberation, all the beauty and love and around Bicycle Day, but really bringing this indigenous perspective and consciousness maybe to the movement and to the fore, as obviously BIA in this program is all about. That's hugely important. Some of the major funders, Dr. Bronner's, in some part, River Styx Foundation, Miriam Violot, and Cody Swift have been huge beneficiaries of the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, and ICEERS, which is doing work on ayahuasca and iboga. And also we're between us probably the top funders of the psychedelic therapy approach. So, there is that at least consciousness, I think, within some of the major funders. And I can think of a few others that really do that. So I think, and I was very excited to hear about Troy Sia and his work and this cactus conservation initiative, and moving to, how can we help the church and start a sacred cultivation of their medicine. Yeah.
That goes very well into a question that I would love Kevin to speak to a bit. Commercialization is something of concern for young folks as part of this movement. And we know that a lot of times, you may have founders of a company who have a certain ethos. As investors and venture capitalists come in, profits go first, and there are fiduciary obligations in LLCs and corporations to put those profit first. We've seen this in cannabis. I guess I'm wondering, is there a different approach? Do you see a mechanism through law reform or the things that David is talking about where we can see them implemented and memorialized in our legal system?
Yeah, thank you, Ariel. That's Great question. I really like the model that the IP34 in Oregon is using right now, where they're actually specifically limiting the number of manufacturer and therapy sites for single licenses to reduce the possibility of monopolizing the market. And I think what's most important here is that if we're taking this movement and honoring it, as a mycelial movement, it's all about supporting local economies and local communities. And so, I think a way that I would love to see us move forward in Colorado is where, if we do have a therapeutic medical regulated model, that it's community focused. The number of licenses are limited per group, and that it's much more about giving back to the local economies and the local communities here. Because I think that a big part of this, at least the grassroots side of this movement, is that it's still so early. We don't even really know what communities need or want. All of us who've done this work, we have great ideas about what's possible here. But I think really to make sure that we're giving everyone a voice, it's really on part of the organizers and folks who are running campaigns and who are talking about broader approaches to this work, to make sure that they're getting deep in their communities. Boots on the ground, talking to community leaders and folks. Just for example, here in Denver, in our 10 Denver districts, to make sure that people are not only educated, but we're finding out hey, if psilocybin does have the potential to treat things like depression and anxiety and that kind of stuff, what do you want to see happen? And then on the other side, there's nothing wrong. I think there's nothing wrong with making a profit in this space, but I think you have to be very careful, because at least from my perspective, it's more important that companies that are operating in the psychedelic space and are providing product or services there, their bottom line, and this may be ignorant, I'm not a businessman to say, but their bottom line should be focused on providing access to the people and minimizing the cost for folks. And people like to call this an industry. I personally don't really like that term. I prefer to think of what's emerging now in the psychedelic renaissance is that we're in this ecosystem, and there are a lot of different organizations, companies, individuals, lawmakers, policymakers. It's this giant ecosystem that I firmly believe has the potential to fully transform nearly every single facet of American society, if not the global society. And my hope is that if this is mycelial, which this is a mycelial movement for sure, in some ways it has a mind of its own. It likes to do its own thing sometimes. And for folks who get on the campaign trail, there's a lot of serendipity. There's a lot of things that just show up out of the blue. But the mycelium, the way that operates is that it's very decentralized. And there isn't necessarily a central figure or a central structure that is, driving the thing as a whole. Each little node can operate independently. And again, to really give credence to the work of what Decriminalized Nature has done, they've managed to, in a mycelial fashion, spread this movement underground, and now we've got cities that are now fruiting bodies popping across the country. Hey, we're here, we're decriminalizing, and it's just this. We're going to hit this mass effect with this. We're going to wake up one day, hopefully in 2022. I saw someone in the chat box. I just wish I could go to sleep and wake up in 2022. We're going to wake up one day and we're going to have, statewide reform. We're going to have decriminalized cities. And I think that if we're preparing for that inevitability and we're doing the work to help make it happen, community is extremely important. Education is critical. We've got to talk about not only the benefits, but also the potential risks. And as David so eloquently mentioned earlier, how we're talking about setting the safety and dosage and all that stuff. So I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of that education front. And thankfully, in many ways, campaigns are an opportunity to really push a tremendous educational effort to bring more people into the awareness of these substances.
People who had the same question for you. So, do you foresee moving forward full decriminalization in Denver?
Can you repeat the question one more time, Ariel?
Do you foresee full decriminalization in Denver?
Well, so if we're describing decriminalizing, we're about as close as we can get to it in Denver. There's no limits, right? There's no enforcement. I think in order to see a full decriminalization, from my opinion, would require removing it from the Schedule 1 list, either at the state level or at the federal level. So, that can be accomplished legislatively, going directly to our legislators, both at the state and the federal level. And so I think, once it's actually removed from the list of Schedule 1 substances, then that's actually decriminalization there. But we're not there yet. So, in Denver, and it is a good distinction, it's lowest enforcement priority and no funds can be used to prosecute folks. So I think we'll get there. But I think we'll get there through the state versus the city in that sense.
Thank you. So I've got one more question to ask Ryan, and then we will wrap it up. Ryan, so if you wouldn't mind just being brief, we are talking about different usage and curious about how much will it cost? How much will it cost in California to put the next initiative together to get it together? How raise enough so that we can make sure that whatever that future initiative looks like is very value aligned?
My God, that's an incredibly complex question. But basically, it's going to come down to whether or not the United States Postal Service is still running leading up to when we actually have to run this. Because the next bout of this, one thing that ended up happening when our initiative got knocked down because of COVID-19, it wasn't just us. There were 24 other states in the District of Columbia that were dealing with this. So we started a process of aggressively reaching out to all the other initiatives that had gotten shut down during this pandemic in the state of California. And what ended up happening is we started reaching out to other initiatives in other states that had gone through something similar. So we put together 5 initiatives on this alliance, and we're definitely going to run these initiatives, some of them, again, coming up in 2022. Going into a non-presidential election, it becomes more expensive if you're pushing drug reform law because it's a conservative issue. If you're pushing conservative issues, it's not so bad. They like to vote early. They like to vote that month before via regular mail. And what ended up happening is one of the other initiatives, it's actually an electronic signature initiative for recalls, referendums, and basic initiatives, not voting. We partnered with them on this campaign trying to push a change.org petition to actually talk to the state to allow us to put these things on for electronic signatures in an extra 90 days. But we didn't get that from the state. We're probably not going to. But what's going to end up happening is our campaign is actually now merging with the electronic signature campaign. And I'm going to take either the deputy director role for it or basically campaign director for the madness of that thing going forward. So I might actually have to run 2 initiatives simultaneously in 2022. And the idea is basically, we know for electronic signatures and voting, it's very popular since COVID-19 has come out. It's not a perfect system in itself, but if we combine it with basically blockchain technology and we merge both initiatives simultaneously, we can partner with 3 to 4 other initiatives, run them all simultaneously. And the cost to send out a packet is anywhere from basically $1 to $1.35. It has the initiative, additional initiatives that could also be signed, a circulator form in there, and a self-addressed stamped envelope that goes back to us. It doesn't actually have postage. It's one of those things that basically says if it's mailed in the US, you can actually mail it to us, then we pay the postage once it comes in. So the cost is between 2.25 and 2.5 million to put a single initiative on the ballot for 2022. And the cost to increase that, it's something like only like $10,000 to $15,000 in extra print cost for every additional initiative that comes in there. So we can actually mitigate the cost between 6 different initiatives and people can sign off for the ones they want. So if we got to go for basically 1 million packets that go out to targeted areas that we know are good, those are basically based off of which counties or cities voted in favor of cannabis legalization is one of the metrics we use to actually gauge whether or not we send voters there. There's a list at the state of California that is a DVD or a flash drive of all the registered voters by Republican, Democrat, no party preference, and whether they voted or not. So we can directly target through the mail to that, and there's a very high validity rate because we already know if they got the mail there, unless they put some other address down, they're good to go. So that's pretty much how we're going to go forward in 2022. And then it's just based off of when COVID-19 has slowed down enough that the state of California has turned on, and then give 2-3 months for society to return. And then we just basically launch a mail campaign and we go out in the first 2 months of 6 months to collect. So that's pretty much the strategy going forward. We didn't do it originally because of psychedelic mushrooms because we figured it'd only be about a 25% send back rate at best. So our cost would have gone to like $4 to $5 million to mail it out. But we know the electronic signature thing right now is very topical and relevant. And the craziest thing is it's allowed us to make a lot of inroad alliances with other political parties and institutions that we never even thought we were going to be talking to or need to. But now this has grown to something much larger. And the craziest thing is there's a lot of cannabis initiatives in other states that are piggybacking off of this. And they have a vested interest in kind of actually matching some of the language we have for the California initiative for magic mushrooms. Because if you were to actually swap out cannabis for magic mushrooms, ours is a pretty good template to go with just as a boilerplate for the philosophy guidelines of what to go for. And then you customize it out by each state. And with all the other cannabis initiatives that got knocked down that have multi-million-dollar campaigns backing them, got a couple of friends in there as well. So we'll see how that pans out. Sorry, it wasn't the shortest of short answers, but there it is.
Thank you so much, Ryan. So I don't know if there's a way that the four of us can be on the screen, but I'll tell you that everyone is really excited by the conversations we're having, and people have tons of questions that they would like asked. So I will do my very best to ask the questions that are requested. We have one question which begins with, if we don't have multiple models growing in different communities at the time of legalization, capitalism will commodify and attempt to monopolize how entheogens are used. So the work that goes on underground building models with different ethnic groups, classes, ages, etc., is critically important to build that can benefit from the tremendous opportunities legalization will present. I do not see a question at the end of that, but if anyone would like to speak to that, that would be great.
So I think maybe the point is saying having a statewide measure will preclude local jurisdictions from doing their own thing, might be what the point is. And I mean, there's always a double-edged sword in that approach. I think on the one hand, your more progressive jurisdictions will, of course, do awesome things, but most will do nothing. So that's kind of where you get that's the logic of making a statewide apply statewide. So then you don't, but then you will have different models in different states, and I think we're all going to learn a lot as we implement our respective programs and like, okay, we could have done this or that better, and learn from them, and just kind of get better at what we're trying to do. And I was a little maybe pessimistic about DC. I just want to say, absolutely, I think we're going to qualify in DC. It is a challenge. Like, we are going to mail basically everybody. We're going to do a test, like Ryan was talking about the return rates. We're going to test, 10,000. Hopefully, we're going to get a good return. And that merits a 250,000 mail to all our likely voters. We'll be able to qualify it that way, or at least get close enough that as soon as we get back on the streets, hopefully in June, we can close the gap. So that's the plan and the strategy. And I'm really loving kind of just the power of the campaign and this the Melissa Lavasani, who's spearheading it. She healed her postpartum depression, and is just such a powerful spokesperson. Works in the city government. Really powerful mailer that's going to be going out featuring her stories and other powerful stories of healing. So we'll see. It's going to be a test. We're all going to learn. Like, well, what kind of return rate can you expect on a mailer? And of course, DC is different from California, but it's a pretty progressive town, all things considered. So we'll share our learnings.
Yeah, great. And actually, with the three of you on stage right now, there are some contrasting or differences between different initiatives and different coalitions. And it would be interesting to have you articulate a little bit more about what that looks like, and then again to speak to the specifics of a harmonized approach.
I'll just jump in with that. With SPORE, with the Society for Psychedelic Outreach, Reform, and Education, we're going very deep here in Denver to help set precedent for what does it look like after decriminalization, right? It's such a big part of the work that we're doing, and that David is doing, and that Ryan is doing. Is really building this kind of nationwide coalition of different groups. And I really I hold true to the idea that, like I have no business leading a campaign in Arizona, or I have no business being in Oregon, or even any business being in Boulder, Colorado, right? Like there are enough folks in this constituency, in this community, this amazing group of people who can take the lead. And I think that's what's important here is, and then also in terms of how we share information and being very highly organized, we have to consider that there are 26 states in the union where you can't have direct democracy in the way that you have a ballot initiative, and so folks have to go directly to their legislature. They have to actually lobby their state legislature, or go and lobby their city lawmakers to make this happen. They can't have a popular vote. And so I think if we're organizing for 2022 and 2024, and in the best ways possible, staying in good communication, and I think really have a chance to learn from Oregon, if they're successful this year, as a good statewide model. How do we communicate? How do we stay in touch? And I think overall, most folks in the space are doing a really good job with that.
Yeah, right on. And I just want to say, like, my article in the MAPS bulletin right now is that unified field theory. It does discuss the different models and how they all complement. We basically have the psilocybin therapy measure model, complementing decrim, complementing broad-based decriminalization, which in some ways is the overarching container. I mean, and depending on our lens, I mean, it's such a society. I mean, all of them are crucial. I mean, these are all crucial measures, and the most powerful healing modality for addiction is psychedelic therapy. So it's just a beautiful 1-2 punch. But yeah, I think when you're spending millions of dollars statewide, if we can figure out how to do this efficiently, not in separate measures, and do them in single measures, and do them in more states in an election cycle, that would be the best. So.
Yeah, thank you. And shout out definitely to your article in the MAPS bulletin. It is awesome. It's a must read.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Bia, and the editing team over there at MAPS to really help shape it into a way better form. Kept asking me hard questions.
So we're going to go, because there's so much excitement. We're going to go for 10 more minutes, if that's all right with you, gentlemen. So some other questions. What recommendations would you make to collectives and organizations trying to advance decriminalization of psychedelic substances in foreign countries? And how can we globally collaborate?
I'll jump in on that one too. I mean, the first thing for sure is to make sure you know how to change laws in your country, right? Like, I don't know how it works in the UK, just like I don't know how it works in South America or any other countries, but if you're doing your research there, understanding like what are the necessary steps to decriminalize, or to start talking to folks or lawmakers who can help in that sense. And yeah, I mean, there's this idea that, if we're all being in communication and we're sharing information, like how or where are we sharing that information, where are people accessing it? And maybe that's something that, should be addressed in the spaces, like, if there's, a resource that folks can access, especially if they're not in the US, this kind of information, just to at least get some kind of an idea of how to move forward. I think also always being very honest with the potential of these substances. When we talk about it, especially in a public forum and we're talking to residents of the city, we always want to make sure that we're talking in terms of potential. And I think it's also very important to make sure that folks are acknowledging the risks with these substances too. We have to include both. Although they're very powerful, there are minimal risks, and those risks there are very serious risks, but those risks can be minimized by proper education, right? So, and then just from what I've seen personally, both in Europe and here in the States, like start organizing, start holding events, once we can, right? Once we can meet again and be in proximity, look out for social clubs in your area. The Psychedelic Society or Psychedelic Club or something like that, or start your own. Just see what the interest is out there in your communities to get going.
Thank you. A lot of people are wanting to know how Indigenous culture specifically is honored and considered in these different particular measures.
So I think I kind of fielded that. Just Deb Francoise Brzot is leading the therapist training criteria, and she was basically adopted by the Mazatec tribe and was trained as a shaman in the Mazatec tradition. So she's pretty much point, along with Tom Eckert, in building out our criteria. So that will be definitely present in the Oregon effort.
And can Ryan, in California, how are Indigenous people and considerations in the initiative, if at all?
Basically, the best thing that we have going for us is the amnestment component. So that's the thing that actually gets out of jail. That's something I don't think any of the other initiatives yet have worked on. So we're pretty much leading the charge on that one as far as social justice reform. And from a personal standpoint, I'm actually half Colombian. My family had a family member. My uncle-in-law was actually in the early 80s killed by cartels, and they stabbed him outside of his house, and we had to ransom the body back. So from the perspective of what it's like for the drug war from the United States that purchases versus a country like Colombia that produces and then smuggles it in, I've seen a lot of horrifying things. But at the state level, for example, you can't really do much for reciprocity to another country. That's something that has to be done at the federal level. And you basically have to break the United States hold on the entire drug game as it is on an international level. Once the United States backs off of this, then the other countries can actually start to fall back. And then we basically have the complete collapse of the current drug war situation as it is. That's my take on it.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question for you from the audience. Why did the California initiative include prevent the profits from the sale of psilocybin mushrooms from going to criminal enterprises, gangs, and cartels? I found this clause to perpetuate dangerous narratives that pipelines Black and brown people into the prison system, especially when Central Americans are being over-policed, being labeled as gang affiliated during this reign of terror on immigrants. I am not. Does Palantir count as a criminal enterprise? Their founder has invested in psilocybin research.
Who?
I'm here as a translator.
Okay. If somebody is making money off of an illegal sale of any substance, that's technically a tax code violation. If they're conducting research and they're going through the actual process of contacting the DEA and the FDA and whatever they're trying to put together as far as research, that's on them at a federal level. It's actually not illegal to study psychedelics in the United States. It's just somewhat difficult, and there's a lot of paperwork, and you have to attach an institution with it. As far as the rest of it, I'm not quite sure where to go with that at that point.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm trying to be very responsive to the people who are participating in this discussion. So some get many, many votes, and that was one that folks wanted to have answered. So we are about time. We've just got a couple minutes left. I'd like to answer this final question, or ask this final question, which is, the three of you have big visions and you take a lot of action, and I'm just kind of curious, very specifically to each of you, what does society look like if your life's mission happens? What do things look like?
A lot more freaky and fun. And it's just a lot more comfortable, all of us being who we are. And it's gonna be awesome. And we're taking care of each other. And, just homelessness is gone. Everybody's just supported. We're just celebrating and living our own most truths and creative selves and magical beings, and living in harmony with nature and respect of the indigenous traditions and cultures. And, peace on earth and goodwill towards men and women and all other beings.
Kevin or Ryan?
Yeah, I think that in so many ways, psychedelics are a metaphor. The experience of psychedelics are a metaphor for the human experience. In one trip, we can, especially at those heavier doses, we can go through a lifetime of experience, I think. And on the other side of that, we have more compassion, more empathy, more understanding and of our differences, but really embracing those and, realizing that, even though we have differences, there's a lot of good work we can do together. There's a lot we can learn from each other. And I really love that whole mycelial model where we have, locally resourced, locally, local supply chains, this kind of decentralized oasis. But it takes a lot to get there, right? And we have a lot of cleaning up to do to make it happen, which also makes it challenging and worthwhile for that goal at the end.
Can I give this one a shot? Okay, look, I want drones, I want flying cars, I want people to be happy, I want a universal income, I want universal health care, I want electronic voting, I want a right to vote to go to war so the president can't just be like, you know what, we got 100 days and go to war without having to go to Congress. I want to be able to vote for all of these things. And honestly, I'd like an end to the opioid epidemic. That is just out of control. I want to talk about real drug dealers out there. You go right to them, okay? Those are the biggest pushers of smack in history. So if you can set up an alternative system where people can get off of that shit, I think that's a beautiful society. And then we can screw up everything else when we go into space and start wars with aliens and stuff. So
the spice must flow.
The new movie is coming out, by the way. You got to see that. It's going to be amazing.
Right on, man. Damn.
Thank you all so much. I'd just like to share with everyone tonight a quote from Alan Watts that my beautiful partner Nicole shared with me to share with all of you. Waking up to who you are requires letting go of who you imagine yourself to be. So when we have these conversations about regulation, decriminalization, and legalization, let's have open minds. Let's lead with listening and curiosity first, and let's let the medicines show us how this is supposed to be. Thank you, gentlemen, so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, thank you, Ariel. Thank you, guys.
For sure.
You're awesome. Thank you.
Good night, guys.
Thank you.